Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, we are living, are we not, through a crisis of capitalism. Multiple crises, indeed, in banking, borrowing, consumption and work, which are beginning to add up to what might be called a nervous breakdown in the system. This is challenging our values, our hopes for the future, and presumably it's not breaking BBC impartiality rules to say that virtually all political leaders sound like they are struggling to find the words, never mind the policies, to respond. Well, today I'm starting the week with three thinkers who have drilled down into the capitalist or market system today and have ideas of their own about what's gone wrong and how we might rebalance our societies. Grigory Yavlinksy was the Russian deputy prime minister who wrote the transition programme to a free market economy. A critic of Putin today, he's analysed what he calls the hidden cause of the Great Recession. Diane Coyle, a British economist whose last book was subtitled How to Run the Economy as If the Future Matters. And she's also defending the trade of economists. But I'm going to turn first to Michael Sandel, the political philosopher whose course in justice at Harvard is legendary, and who has been looking in his new book at what money can't buy. Michael, this is about the moral limits of markets, and your fundamental opening position is that we have moved from a market economy to a market society. Explain the difference between the two things.
The difference is this: a market economy is a tool, a valuable and effective tool for organizing productive activity. But a market society is a place where almost everything is up for sale. It's a way of life in which market values seep into every domain of life and crowd out important non-market values.
And we might see this in everyday life. In what way? The relentless spread of advertising everywhere, or queue jumping? Explain.
Well, take advertising. Almost every place now is a potential venue for advertising. There are companies that sell body tattoos. One woman sold for $10,000 the right to a casino to advertise with a permanent tattoo on her forehead. Queue jumping, paying to jump the queue. It's familiar at airports, those long security lines. One can pay to jump to the head of the queue to be checked for security. Shakespeare in the Park, in Central Park.
Now, this is a great tradition in New York, isn't it? It's free Shakespeare.
Free public theater in the summertime. But not everyone wants to stand on the long queue to get the free ticket. And so now there's a cottage industry of line standers who will do it for you for a fee. There are line-standing companies in Washington, D.C. that provide lobbyists an opportunity to get a seat in a congressional hearing without having to stand for 24 hours or more on the queue. Line-standing companies hire the homeless and others to stand on the queue, giving way to the lobbyists just before the hearing begins.
And I'm thinking of an event coming up in London, the Olympics, of course, where there's a bubbling controversy about how many tickets go not just to the sort of top officials and the national teams and so on, but to the corporate world, the people who have actually put in a lot of the sponsorship. Is your contention that kind of distinction between the elite who've paid for the tickets, paid for the good sporting tickets, get to the top of the queue in airports, and the rest, is dangerous because it undermines the sense that we're all part of the same society? Is that the fundamental problem?
Yes. If everything comes to be up for sale, if money governs in every sphere of life, then it's less and less the case that we can think of ourselves as sharing a common life, and this ultimately is corrosive of democracy.
There are lots of examples from health and education. There's one that people may not be so familiar with, but really did shock me, which is the market that developed in life assurance, originally with AIDS patients.
Yes.
Just explain how that worked.
Yes. Traditionally, life insurance is to provide for the security of one's family. But increasingly now, there's a secondary market in life insurance where a third party, a broker, can buy someone's life insurance policy and become the beneficiary. It began with those who were terminally diagnosed with AIDS. People would buy their life insurance policy at a discount carry on paying the premiums, and then collect when the person died.
And they would meanwhile allow that person to have access to money they wouldn't otherwise have got, of course.
That's true. It set in place, though, a perverse incentive, a rooting interest by the investor in the person dying sooner rather than later. The sooner the person dies, the bigger the return. And now this has actually become a multi-billion-dollar industry, buying the life insurance policies of strangers, hoping they die quickly for a quicker return. In fact, on Wall Street now, they have securitized death bonds, as they're called, bets on when people will die, sliced and diced as they did with mortgage securities, doing for death what they once did for mortgages.
Oh, that's a horrible, horrible thought. You yourself, however, in the book, point out that the origins of the life insurance industry in London coffee houses, that was pretty grisly too. People were betting on how quickly other people died and so on. And I wonder more generally whether this market society is anything new, whether if we look back before the welfare state and before the 20th century to a world when there was much less free education, if any at all, where you could buy child prostitutes on the streets and so on, whether these earlier societies weren't actually market societies as well.
Right, it's a great question. I think over 2 centuries, roughly, we managed to establish certain norms, even before the welfare state arrived, to stave off the coarsening effects, the worst coarsening effects of markets. So down in the London docks, it was once possible to take out a so-called life insurance policy on somebody else's captain or cargo, in a sense, to place a bet on whether someone else's ship would return or not. That all changed with the doctrine of insurable interest. You had to have a stake in the outcome to buy an insurance policy. It was a way of separating the morally tawdry activity of gambling on life or other people's misfortune from legitimate insurance. So over 2 centuries, we've moved away from that coarsening activity. But in the last 3 decades, it's a period I've called a time of market triumphalism. It's as if we've drifted back, and many of the norms that have kept markets in their place have eroded, and increasingly now market values govern just about every sphere of life.
Now, just before we open this up, one last line of questioning. All the way through this book, there is the argument made very persuasively that markets and paying and pricing have pushed out something else. But I'm still not quite clear what the something else is. There is a sort of ghost of proper public ethics, civic behaviour, communality. And I wonder what that comes from. What is the essence of it? Is it a sort of Judeo-Christian belief in looking out for each other? What is being pushed out by the market?
Well, there are multiple goods being pushed out by the market, not just one good. But one of the most fateful, I think, has to do with the broad category of civic goods. And we've spoken just now of citizenship, in the sense that we're all in this together. Take one small but quite fateful example. In Iraq and Afghanistan, there were more paid military contractors on the ground than there were U.S. military troops. Now, we never had a public debate about whether we wanted to outsource war to private companies, but that is what happened. And my concern is that without explicit public deliberation about where markets serve the public good and where they don't belong, markets will decide these questions for us. And so the goods may vary from education to health to civic life to personal relations. But what I suggest...
Something about a sense of equality underneath, not absolute equality, but there is, and you're no socialist, but there is some notion of civic equality underneath what you're saying.
In the case of the civic goods, yes. My suggestion is not that democracy requires perfect equality, but that it does require that men and women from different backgrounds and walks of life encounter one another in the ordinary course of life, bump up against one another, and the more money governs, the greater the tendency for the affluent and for those of modest means to live separate lives. And that, it seems to me, is corrosive of the commonality that democracy requires.
Diane Coyle, that's, for many people, a highly persuasive argument. How persuaded are you?
Very persuaded, and I think a lot of people would agree that marketisation or commercialisation has gone into areas where they don't like to see it, and who could look at the financial markets and not believe that there have been excesses in those? Of course there have. But I think the boundaries are actually quite hard to pin down. So to take the example of queuing, you gave the example of queuing for free Shakespeare in Central Park. What about road tolls, which are making it possible for some people to skip the queues on the roads? They're more efficient, they raise money for roads. I think they're a very pragmatic way of taking advantage of the fact that time is more valuable to some people than it is to others. But that's queue jumping as well. So where does the boundary lie between the ones that you do want to accept and the ones that you don't want to accept? And I think that's quite a difficult question. And it's not just about norms, it's about institutions as well. So the gambling markets, whether it's life insurance or the financial markets and the derivatives, you've talked about the social norms, the moral norms that people have engaging in those activities. But there are institutional factors too. We used to have partnerships in the financial markets and mutual insurance organisations. So I think we need also to think about how do we cement in those civic values through the institutions that we have.
Michael, if you could pick up particularly the point about how you draw those boundaries, because that is a difficult question.
It is a difficult question, and I think that's one of the reasons that we have relied as if by default on markets and on market solutions. I think our love of markets is not only that they deliver the goods. I think there's a deeper appeal, and that's the promise of a certain non-judgmental stance. Markets don't pass judgment, or don't seem to pass judgment, on the goods being exchanged. And so it's as if we can be neutral on those goods. And I think that's a mistake. I think that what's been missing from our public debate is grappling with exactly the distinctions that Diane is insisting that I take up, rightly so, that we have to decide what is it about the good of education, for example, that can help us decide whether to provide cash incentives to students to read books or to get good grades, as many school districts in the U.S. are now doing. We need to argue about the purpose and the good that education serves. What attitudes are we hoping to cultivate in students? And it will be different for traffic, and it will be different for military service.
Do they work or not? And there are examples of financial incentives that do and ones that don't. There are randomised control trials in India that show that cash incentives don't work, helping people encourage people to get vaccinations for their children, but a free bag of lentils will. And so, as an economist, I would say go with the free bag of lentils there. But if the $2 to read a book works somewhere else, then let's use that.
Grigory Yavlinksy, I'd like to ask whether in Russia you have seen something similar post the arrival of capitalism in terms of the marketisation, everything up for sale, and a sense that traditions of everybody having a sort of civic commonality have been eroded.
Russia is completely a different case. It's just kind of a peripheral capitalism, so it's not the case which you have in Europe or United States. So we have problems with the markets itself, not only with the expansion of the market relations to education or healthcare or somewhere else, but there is a big problem inside the economy itself, by the way, in the same way I see it in the world economy as well. So I want to add to that discussion saying that the morality and the fundamental thing of the economic markets, which is confidence, trust, is a thing which is underlined in the developments of the markets in the last 20, 30 years.
And you can't have successful markets unless you have you can't simply legislate for markets to work well. You have to have a basis of morality and trust, otherwise they're bound to fail.
So that's exactly what I want to underline, that I don't believe that it is possible to have in the long run sustainable economic growth, and it is possible to have effective economic system without trust and morality inside the economic market relations inside the economy, not only outside, but inside as well. So it's not only a question about where markets should work, it's also the question how the markets should work, even in the economy itself.
Absolutely. And Michael Sandel used the phrase market triumphalism, looking at the functioning of markets inside a society. But you could also apply market triumphalism as a phrase to what's happened across the world in the last 30 or 40 years, the notion that you can simply impose quite quickly a market society on a different kind of culture and it will automatically work.
Yes, and in Russian case, as you asked me, it's the good demonstration that simply imposing the market relation into the society where the profit and the greed is the final destination just ruined everything inside the economy as well. So that's what we can see just now through the crisis. And I think that it's one of the main causes of the economic recession in the world, and that's why the politicians is not able to give the answer.
And it's caused, to be clear, because of the number of players at different levels who are taking a cut, who are being paid, who are simply getting money to pass a securitized object on, or whatever it might be. In other words, they don't have a larger vision of the society they're working inside.
The problem here is that there is a lot of different groups. The managers of the business, the expert society, the political society, and let's say rating agencies, many groups which are engaged in this game. And the problem which I see that all of them do see the problems of the markets. They do see that the many things was done wrong, but because of profits and because of greed, they are not reacting on that. That means that the regulations which the politicians want to impose just now wouldn't work as well, because it's a different case.
I see. And if we're talking about market triumph on a kind of political global scale, where does that come from, do we think? Because to what extent is that a reaction to what happened after the Second World War and then during the Cold War? Was market triumphalism the sort of search for a new ideology in the West? Where did that come from, do you think?
I think that the beginning of that started immediately after the Second World War in the debate when the American establishment was thinking what to oppose to the communist collectivism which was spreading itself after the Second World War. And individualism came as the answer. And then what was prepared for the Cold War became the real belief in the society which prepared it as a tool or as a weapon against the communist Russia. It started to work in America and Great Britain, by the way.
So we had the illusion that life was all communal, that there was nothing other than the herd, and then we had the opposing illusion that life was all individual.
Yes, exactly. And I think that Adam Curtis made that point very clearly.
But then,
Diane Coyle.
The end of communism helped the market triumphalism by seeming to demonstrate that one of them didn't work and one of them did. And that coincided with a particular period of economic theory when it became much more abstract to talk about markets as an abstract entity. But of course markets aren't. They're institutions as well. They're embedded in societies. They have particular people, as you're saying, Grigory, particular interest groups, powerful people who can manipulate them. And so the kind of market you have is fundamentally important to how well they work. And that's something that we lost sight of in the abstraction.
Do you think, Michael Sandel, that people, the political classes, during the period that you're talking about, the last 20 or 30 years in particular, simply became too awestruck by the world of big money? They lost any sense of opposing authority or countervailing forces that used to be.
I think it's partly that, and I think there's a lot to this explanation about the Cold War and the end of the Cold War. I think that we in the West overinterpreted or misinterpreted the meaning of the end of the Cold War. We concluded that capitalism had won, markets had won. This was the market triumphalist faith. And at the heart of that faith, I think, was the idea that markets are the primary instruments for achieving the public good. That's the heart of the faith. But I think it was a misinterpretation because it assumed that markets and that capitalism were just one thing everywhere, that there was only one kind of capitalism, that markets belonged everywhere in every sphere of life. And this was reinforced, as Diane has just suggested, by developments within economics, which made economics much more abstract. I look back at an old economics textbooks from the 50s and 60s, defined economics as concerned with avoiding depressions and avoiding inflation, wages, prices, stocks, bonds, foreign trade. Today's textbooks define economics as the interaction among individuals in a society. It's a remarkable difference. It's
takeover. It's a complete takeover of all the other humanities.
Yes, it's a science of everyday life. And so at the very time that markets triumphed or seemed to after the Cold War, economics redefined itself as a science of all human behavior, and I think that was a great mistake.
Diane Coyle, you are charged guilty of hostile takeover of the entire of Western culture from the point of view of an economist.
I think this is a true description of the state of the subject. Until a while ago, arguably 20 years ago, in the past 20 years or so, economists have been taking a very different kind of approach to the subject, looking at the importance of institutions, which features a lot in discussions of economic growth now, looking at behavioural economics, which looks at how people actually do make decisions and not making an assumption that they always behave rationally. So it's become a much less abstract subject now. The centre of the gravity of the subject, I think, has shifted a lot. But that shift has not yet happened in public philosophy. And I think the marketisation is actually lingering in public life much longer than it's lingering in economics.
Has the problem been that there haven't been clearly expressed belief systems in economics as there used to be, that people approach economics from a political or indeed religious or moral standpoint? And there has been the sense that once you cross the border into the economics department, those value systems can be left behind, that you're now into a kind of pure world of forces that can be just analysed in their own right.
That's probably true, and there's a good aspect of that, which is that it focuses you on the pragmatic, looking at data and seeing what actually is effective. But as you're hinting, it does also take you away from some very important questions.
And hollow things out a bit.
Indeed, and make it too narrow and technical. One
thing that we haven't talked about yet is time frames, because your book, your last book, about, I'm just going to get the title here, How to Run the Economy as If the Future Matters, the Economics of Enough. One of the things that you discuss a great deal is how you put back into public debate things such as the value of nature, the cost of pollution, but also long-term problems about fairness between generations, the pension burden, and all the rest of it, because markets tend to be very much here and now institutions, immediate institutions, requiring an immediate fix.
Which is paradoxical, because what they're supposed to do is capture future information in today's prices, but we've not had the information about the future in any of the statistics that we collect. And because markets are driven by data and economists are driven by data, not having data that tells you what's happening in the future is a really significant problem.
Michael Sandel.
I think that Diane is a very thoughtful dissenter from what I take to be mainstream economics. I do think it's a welcome development insofar as economists become more empirical, as behavioral economists and others have done. But I think the other thing that's missing from economics as it's understood in practice today is a connection with moral and political philosophy. If you go back to the grand tradition of moral and political economy, all the way back to Adam Smith, economics was understood to be a subfield of moral and political philosophy. That's the way it was for Adam Smith, for John Stuart Mill, for Marx, for that matter. Across the ideological spectrum, the classical economists understood their subject to be a branch of moral and political philosophy. In the 20th century, that changed. Economics aspired to be a value-neutral science. But of course it wasn't value-neutral. It was essentially implementing a very particular political philosophy, a theory of value drawn from utilitarian moral philosophy. And it's that theory of value that I think is contestable and corrosive when applied beyond the material realm in areas of health, education, civic life, personal relations, and the like. So I think we need to get back to engaging economic questions as moral and political questions.
I'm interested in this notion of the market as self-fulfilling, self-perpetuating, believing that it exists outside everything else in a sense. Grigory, in your book you talk about post-industrialism, a kind of postmodernism in the modern market. And you're quite sceptical about a lot of the products that we are endlessly selling one another and then throwing away and buying again. Explain.
The key idea is that originally economy and the markets were to serve the public demand, to satisfy the public. Now the things changed in the way that the producers are trying to influence the society and to create new demand, which the people very often don't need absolutely. So it's postmodern in the sense that they change their places. Not the markets are serving the people, but the people are serving the highest profits of the players in the markets. And that is the key question for the bubbles.
It's the upgrade. It's the iPad 9. It's the is that what we're talking about? The endless requirement
if you take the most simple example, you can't buy the mobile phone without camera. You don't need camera in the mobile phone. You don't need tape recorder in the mobile phone. You need simply mobile phone to call each other. But there is no possibility just to buy it as it is. So you are creating a new demand, saying the things which are not real at all. The same, especially in the computer science, also the same thing.
Diane, this comes also to the area of the problem of growth that you talk about as well, doesn't it? Where growth comes from, what growth is.
Well, the counter-argument is that people didn't know they needed mobile phones at all until somebody invented them and started to market them. And when they were first introduced, they were treated as yuppie luxuries and they were taxed. But if they hadn't been introduced and marketed to yuppies in Western societies who wanted the latest upgrade, they wouldn't now be used in Africa to create jobs and give people access to banking systems.
But my argument is that you're absolutely right if you have special demand for communication. But now you already have the answer on this question, and around this you have a lot of new qualities which in the moment you have no need for them. And another thing, it is monopolized. You can't satisfy your demand by something which you exactly need.
But you have no need for them, but you don't know what other people's needs might be.
Yes, but they must have a choice. There is simply no choice in that sense.
Well, that's an argument about competition, which I heartily agree with. Competition is important.
Competition is absolutely important, but trying by intellectual mythology to trick the people, to create the demand which they don't need, in fact, yes, saying them that it is something absolutely new, that this is for the future, and so on and so far, you're creating one bubble after another, and then you have recession and crisis.
I want to come back to the question of what are the values and what are the value systems that are being pushed out by excessive marketisation. Because it seems to me, if we are going through a period when we are going to have much less growth, when the material limits of endless growth seem to be reached, we have some real questions about what replaces that. Where does happiness come from? Where do the satisfactions come from? And that seems to me to be a sort of ghost in the machine behind all your books. Michael Sandel.
Well, I think that one of the reasons this question is so difficult, Andrew, and that you rightly come back to it, is that the alternative to a utilitarian or an economistic account of value is what I would describe as a pluralist account of value. So, for example, Why do we hesitate when we read about a charity that pays drug-addicted women $300 to be sterilized so they won't have more babies? Well, we think there's something fundamentally violating the dignity of the women to do that, or to pay people to donate blood, or to buy and sell kidneys, or to pay women to donate eggs. These all have to do with questions of dignity in the body.
You say we have an instinctive part of our lives that we want to be outside the market, where we want to be able to react to each other in a non-market way. And for instance, you've given some very good examples where people are, if a doctor is asked to treat poor people for nothing, he or she may well do it. If they're offered a small amount of money to treat people, they may well say, no, I don't want the money.
Right, because what's at stake here are intrinsic goods, having to do with dignity in the case of the body, or in the case of the doctor who is willing to donate his or her care to the indigent. It's a sense of responsibility, a professional duty. And so what market values erode or override are the various intrinsic goods that matter. Some are to do with dignity, some are to do with questions of ethos and professionalism, as in the doctor case. Some are to do with the intrinsic goods of learning, if we're talking about education. And in the civic sphere, which we talked about earlier, there may be intrinsic goods to do with the commonality, the being in it together.
You talk about people bumping into each other. That's where the sense of, if not equality, at least we all stand on the same pavement.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and live under the same sky.
And that's why we don't have, for example, a market in votes. From the standpoint of standard economic analysis, it would be efficient to let people buy and sell votes. Many people don't use their votes. Why not let them sell them and get something for it? There would be people who would be happy to buy them. From the standpoint of efficiency, there's no good reason not to allow such a market. But we believe that the vote is an expression of public responsibility, not a piece of private property.
Grigory Yavlinksy, do you have a similar sense of where the values come from that stand outside the market and have to be there to support effective markets and effective economies?
Yes, I want simply to say that without very deep rethinking of the role of the social and moral values in the economy, there is no way to overcome the recession. And once again, I want to underline why the politician is not prepared to give the recipe and to give the answer, because they are part of the system themselves. They
have to keep offering growth. They have to keep offering something.
When the business comes together with the politics in order to have the highest profits, that's paralyzed whatever possibility for the political system to answer the key question of the markets and also of the economy as a general system.
That sounds as if we are in a very deep hole indeed, Diane Coyle. Do you agree with that?
I'm not sure I do. I'm a bit of a utilitarian, and I believe in growth because growth is what brings us new products and innovations, new medicines, new book titles, and gives people jobs. So we do need it, and we have to work out how to make sure that we're not eating tomorrow's potential incomes by overdoing it today.
And you're a sceptic of these sort of happiness index economics?
I think absolutely it's much more important. Of course you need to know what natural resources you're using up and how much energy and how much carbon you're emitting, but it's much more important to understand what legacy you're leaving for the next generation, because that tells you whether what you're doing is sustainable or not. But it's really important to distinguish market processes, which are very efficient tools for making things better, from monetary values, and they're distinct. And you don't want to put monetary values on everything, but you can still use the processes. And examples are the kidney exchange programs where no money changes hands, but they use a market process to match up the supply and the demand.
And where, for you, do the essential non-economic, non-monetary values that underpin a successful market system come from? Or do you think there isn't an answer to that? There's simply a multiplicity of different value systems.
I think the answer does lie in the civic values and the capabilities, what you leave people capable of, both now and in the future.
Michael Sandel, it seemed, reading your book, What Money Can't Buy, that there's the spirit of a certain kind of America behind it. And I would call it the kind of America of Walter Lippmann and Galbraith and so on. It's something around the sort of rather more austere, the Judeo-Christian values of America in the middle of the 20th century, perhaps before the extremes of market triumphalism had affected the society. Is that a fair reading?
Well, I like that characterization, Andrew. Thank you for it. Yes, I think that's fair enough. In this book, and maybe in earlier books too, I'm leaning against what I take to be the excesses of liberalism and markets as they've been played out most vividly, perhaps, but not exclusively, in the United States. I think many of these trends and the market triumphalism that animates them can be seen around the world, though perhaps America is the leading edge of this development, in which case it can provide a cautionary note, I think, for the drift of things away from having a market economy toward becoming a market society.
Grigory, this can only be pushed forward, the arguments we've been having, through politics. Do you think there's been a problem that, not just in Russia, but around the world, there's been such a polarization between people who are so-called sort of pro-market capitalists on the right and people who are so-called socialists? In other words, that we're having this debate still in the shadow of the great ideological clashes of the Cold War, and that we don't have the political language yet to criticize, to critique what's gone wrong in modern capitalism.
Yes, I want to underline 2 points. First of all, it seems to me that it is really, as Michael put it, a misunderstanding of the end of the Cold War, in terms that it was a vision that now the American and capitalist system would be good for everybody and would take the end of history. But I think that the end of the Cold War showed a different thing, which was not understood at that time, that after the Cold War, the two-polar world become multi-polar. The diversity came. So it's a new paradigm, which is not still yet in the politics. The same with the ideologies. The vision that there are only two ideologies, the capitalist ideology and leftist ideology, I think for the 21st century is wrong. And what we see just now, that we still have no answer on the philosophy of developments in the world. Another point I want to say, that I absolutely agree that the economic growth and the modernization of and innovations is very important for the economic development of the society. But the question is, how to make the line between the real economic growth and kind of intellectual alchemistry, I would put it in that way, when you are working with something which is not real, and that's for economy is a very dangerous development, and it's come more and more in the world. The same with the ideologies.
Yes. Now, I want to finish because Diane Coyle's been giving some lectures about sort of defending the profession of economists. We've been having a go at economics from all sorts of different angles today. But your view is that there's a big difference between macroeconomics, where there seems to be kind of people say, well, how come it's a science if economists disagree about so many basic fundamental things? It can't be. Scientists basically agree and then they build upwards from there. Economists don't. But you would see the role of the economist as being something rather different. You used the word a bit like a dentist, I think was the image you used.
Two kinds of economics. There's the kind that's pragmatic about particular markets or particular problems than microeconomics, and I think that is much more like a science. There are new data sets and techniques for analysing data, and we're slowly learning much more about what things work and what things don't. And then there's macroeconomics, where the kind of abstraction that we talked about earlier still prevails. And so macroeconomic models in the textbooks, as Michael was saying, don't have banks and financial institutions in them, which seems extraordinary now, and has caused, I would say, at least in this country, quite a big re-evaluation of what economists have been doing. So some bits of it are useful, and I would defend some bits of it, and other bits I think we are in ideological territory where people shout at each other with different views.
And where we need the odd political philosopher, Michael Sandel, to help us.
Well, I think that in the end the question of markets is not ultimately an economic question. It's a question of how we want to live together, and that's a question of values.
And that's a very good note to end on. Thank you to all of you. Grigory Yavlinsky's Real Economic, which is based on Realpolitik, and Michael Sandel's What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets, are both out now. Diane Coyle's The Economics of Enough was published last year, and her Tanner lectures on the public responsibility of the economist will soon be available via the Start the Week website. Next week, we're going to be meandering the highways and byways with Robert McFarlane, Jonathan Meads, and Thomas Heatherwick, the designer. But finally, an apology to all of those who have tried valiantly to email the programme at starttheweek@bbc.co.uk recently. Our email address wasn't working, and we didn't know, because it took quite a long time to find a man with a screwdriver, indeed 6 weeks. It's been off for a long time, but the screwdriver has worked. It's now working, and we look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.
Yes, just before the hearing begins.
And I'm thinking of an event coming up in London, the Olympics, of course, where there's a bubbling controversy about how many tickets go not just to the sort of top officials and the national teams and so on, but to the corporate world, the people who have actually put in a lot of the sponsorship. Is your contention that kind of distinction between the elite who've paid for the tickets, paid for the good sporting tickets, get to the top of the queue in airports, and the rest, is dangerous because it undermines the sense that we're all part of the same society? Is that the fundamental problem?
Yes. If everything comes to be up for sale, if money governs in every sphere of life, then...
Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, we are living, are we not, through a crisis of capitalism. Multiple crises, indeed, in banking, borrowing, consumption and work, which are beginning to add up to what might be called a nervous breakdown in the system. This is challenging our values, our hopes for the future, and presumably it's not breaking BBC impartiality rules to say that virtually all political leaders sound like they are struggling to find the words, never mind the policies, to respond. Well, today I'm starting the week with 3 thinkers who have drilled down into the capitalist or market system today and have ideas of their own about what's gone wrong and how we might rebalance our societies. Grigory Yavlinsky was the Russian deputy prime minister who wrote the transition programme to a free market economy. A critic of Putin today, he's analysed what he calls the hidden cause of the Great Recession. Diane Coyle, British economist whose last book was subtitled How to Run the Economy as If the Future Matters. And she's also defending the trade of economists. But I'm going to turn first to Michael Sandel, the political philosopher whose course in justice at Harvard is legendary and who has been looking in his new book at what money can't buy. Michael, this is about the moral limits of markets, and your fundamental opening position is that we have moved from a market economy to a market society. Explain the difference between the two things.
The difference is this: a market economy, paying to jump the queue. It's familiar at airports, those long security lines. One can pay to jump to the head of the queue to be checked for security. Shakespeare in the Park, in Central Park.
Now, this is a great tradition in New York, isn't it? It's free Shakespeare.
Free public theater in the summertime. But not everyone wants to stand on the long queue to get the free ticket. And so now there's a cottage industry of line standers who will do it for you for a fee. There are line-standing companies in Washington, D.C. that provide lobbyists an opportunity to get a seat in a congressional hearing without having to stand for 24 hours or more on the queue. Line-standing companies hire the homeless and others to stand on the queue, giving way to the lobby. Economy is a tool, a valuable and effective tool for organizing productive activity. But a market society is a place where almost everything is up for sale. It's a way of life in which market values seep into every domain of life and crowd out important non-market values.
And we might see this in everyday life. In what way? The relentless spread of advertising everywhere, or queue jumping? Explain.
Well, take advertising. Almost every place now is a potential venue for advertising. There are companies that sell body tattoos. One woman sold for $10,000 the right to a casino to advertise with a permanent tattoo on her forehead. Queue jumping